The word hit the air of the Alden ranch yard like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through Noah Alden's chest nearly unmade him where he stood. "Without pay," Birdie Brooks had said. Just like that. Simple, clean, offered with those dark eyes holding his gaze in the blinding September sun of 1882, her hands folded in front of her flour-dusted apron, as though she were discussing nothing more consequential than the weather rolling in off the Cimarron Hills. Noah looked at her for a long time. He was not a man given to long looking. He was built from quick decisions, from the instinct that kept a herd from scattering, from the kind of certainty that you either had or you did not have out here on the New Mexico Territory range. He had stared down a river at flood stage, had looked a rustler in the eye without blinking, had watched the bank notice arrive that morning, and had not let his hands shake when he unfolded it. But Birdie Brooks, standing in his yard, offering herself freely to save his harvest, undid something in him that those other things had never touched, because she knew about the bank notice. She had too. The whole town of Redemption Creek knew or suspected. Caleb Marsh at the general store had that way of letting information seep through his counter like water through cracked leather, and Noah's silence on the matter had probably confirmed what people guessed. The Alden cattle operation was bleeding. The summer drought had starved the grazing land. 3 of his best hands had left for silver wages in Colorado, and the sorghum field he had planted as a hedge against cattle prices was standing ripe and heavy and absolutely untended because he could not afford the labor. So she knew. She had come here knowing. And still she had offered, and the thing that had frozen him in place, the thing that made him look at her and not be able to stop, was that he could not figure out why. Birdie Brooks was a mystery that Redemption Creek had spent 6 months cataloging without success. She had arrived in May on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line with a single trunk, a letter of reference from a church in Wichita that nobody had sent for, and no explanation that fully accounted for a woman of 24 traveling alone to a territory town. She had taken the teaching position at the one-room schoolhouse on Cotter Road, because old Mrs. Delacroix had died in March and the children needed someone, and she had taught the 31 students of Redemption Creek with a fierce and quiet competence that earned her exactly 2 things in the social ledger of that town: respect and suspicion. Respect because the children learned. Suspicion because she never quite answered a personal question directly. Not a single one. And now she was standing in Noah Alden's yard offering to harvest his sorghum for nothing, and he was standing there looking at her like a man who had just been handed a gift wrapped in barbed wire, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to hold without bleeding. "Why?" he finally said. The word came out rougher than he intended, more demanding, with an edge that could have been mistaken for hostility. He saw the slight shift in her expression, not quite a flinch, more like someone bracing for a wind they had predicted. "Because the field is ready to come in," she said, "and you are short of hands, and those are facts that do not require explaining. Every act requires explaining, Miss Brooks." He crossed his arms over his chest, not as a wall against her but as a way of holding himself together, particularly a free one. Something flickered in her eyes then, not offense. Something deeper and older than offense, something that looked, and this would strike him later as significant, like recognition. "My father lost a harvest once," she said. "We did not recover from it." She paused, and the pause held weight. "I would not wish that on a person I could help. That is the entire explanation." It was not the entire explanation. He knew it the way a man knows a storm on the horizon even before the clouds properly form. There was something beneath those words, some dark past she was carrying like a stone in her chest, and he did not know what it was, but he felt its shape through the careful quiet of her voice. He said, "I cannot take charity." She said, "It is not charity, I have a condition." And there it was. There was the barbed wire. He waited. "Teach me to ride," she said, "properly, not side saddle. I want to know how to handle a horse the way a person handles a horse when there is real country to cross." He stared at her, a schoolteacher asking a cattleman to teach her to ride astride in exchange for 2 weeks of harvest labor in the blazing New Mexico September heat. It was, on the face of it, an absurd negotiation. It was, beneath the face of it, something he could not yet name. "You have a deal," he said. And he did not know, standing there in that hot yard with the smell of ripe sorghum drifting from the south field, that those 4 words would change everything he had believed about his life, his future, and the particular color of his solitude. Now let us go back 6 months to understand exactly what had brought them both to that yard, to that moment, to that word that hung in the September air like a hawk riding a thermal, circling and waiting to land. May of 1882 had come in warm and hopeful, the way that season always lies to you in the high desert country of New Mexico. The grass along the Cimarron was green enough to make a man believe in Providence, and Noah Alden had made the decision to expand, to put in the sorghum field on the south quarter that he had been contemplating for 3 years. He was 31 years old. He had run the Alden cattle operation alone since his father's death in 1879, and he was at the precise point in a man's life where he either commits fully to the future or lets it slide away unbuilt. He committed. He borrowed against the land. He planted the field. He hired 2 extra seasonal hands, and he planned to hire more come harvest. The summer then proceeded to destroy every plan he had made with the patient efficiency of a drought. The rains stopped in July. Not gradually, not with any warning that allowed adjustment, just stopped, as though the sky had signed a contract with some other territory and forgotten to renew the one with New Mexico. The grass yellowed. The cattle weights dropped. The prices at the Cimarron River Cattle Drive fell because every rancher within 300 miles was selling simultaneously, flooding the market with thin cattle, and the price collapsed in the way that prices always do when fear is running the market instead of sense. Noah sold what he had to sell. He held what he had to hold. He watched his margin dissolve from something solid to something theoretical, and by August the banknote that he had taken against the South Quarter land was sitting on his kitchen table like an accusation he could not refute. The sorghum, against all logic, had survived. The South Quarter sat over a shallow aquifer, and the roots had found water that the summer sky had refused to provide. The field stood in late August like a miracle, full and heavy and golden, and Noah Alden looked at it every morning with an emotion that was equal parts gratitude and despair, because he did not have the hands to bring it in. His 3 remaining permanent hands, Cobb, Jasper, and a young man named Ruiz who had been with the operation 2 years, were occupied completely with the cattle, moving the herd to the northern pasture where a creek still ran, keeping the water rotation going, doing the daily work that could not be suspended even for a week. Hiring harvest labor cost money he did not have. And every day that passed was a day the sorghum risked the autumn winds that could flatten a mature field in a single night if a storm came through with enough force. He had not told anyone how bad it was. That was his father's teaching, sealed into him like a brand. You do not show the wound in public because predators can smell blood from a great distance. You handle your trouble quietly, and you present a face of capability to the world, and you sort it out in private. He had almost managed it. He almost always almost managed everything. What he had not counted on was Birdie Brooks. Birdie had arrived in Redemption Creek on the 14th of May, stepping off the train in a brown wool traveling dress that was too heavy for the weather, carrying herself with a posture so straight and deliberate that it looked, to the people watching from the platform, like a decision she was making with her spine rather than a natural attitude. She was not pretty in the way that Redemption Creek's social register recognized pretty. She had strong features, dark eyes that moved over a room with an attention that felt almost clinical, and a mouth that rested in a neutral expression that some people read as coldness and others read as thought. She had taken the teaching position and moved into the 2-room house behind the schoolhouse that the county provided. and she had begun to establish the quiet, ordered life of a woman who intends to stay without advertising that intention. Noah had met her formally at the church social in June, introduced by Reverend Hadley's wife Constance, who had appointed herself the administrative center of Redemption Creek's social life, as thoroughly as Caleb Marsh had appointed himself the center of its information life. Constance Hadley introduced people the way a matchmaker introduces prospects, with a particular angle and a particular brightness in her eye. Noah had shaken Birdie Brooks's hand and said the ordinary things a person says, and she had said the ordinary things in return, and they had stood at the edge of the social gathering with their cups of lemonade and talked about the summer heat with the kind of careful surface conversation that two private people conduct when they have correctly identified each other as private. He had noticed, even then, that she did not answer personal questions directly. He had asked where she was from originally, and she had said Kansas, which was technically an answer and practically nothing. He had asked what had brought her to Redemption Creek specifically, and she had said the teaching position, which was also technically an answer and practically nothing. He had not pressed. He understood the architecture of those answers because he built the same kind himself. What he had thought, driving back to the ranch that evening in the June dusk, was that Birdie Brooks was running from something. He had not thought it unkindly. He had thought it with the recognition of a man who had also, in his fashion, been running, though in his case from nothing more dramatic than loneliness, which is its own kind of ghost. He had not thought about her again with any particular frequency through July and August because he had been too busy managing disaster to think about anything personal. He had seen her twice in town on supply runs, had tipped his hat, had received a nod in return, and that had been the full extent of their contact until the morning of September the 3rd, 1882, when she appeared at the gate of the Alden Ranch at 7 in the morning and made her offer. After he said yes, after they shook on it, there was a brief and strange silence in the yard, the kind that follows a decision that both parties have already recognized as significant even if neither is prepared to say so. "You will need work clothes," he said finally. "That dress will not survive a day in the sorghum." "I have work clothes," she said, and something in the way she said it suggested that work was not a foreign concept to her, not a dignified condescension she was performing, but a thing she had done with her body before and intended to do again. "The crew starts at 6, he said. "You will work alongside Ruiz, he knows the field." "All right," she said. "Miss Brooks." He stopped her as she turned to go. She turned back. The morning sun was full in her face, and he could see that she was tired. Not today tired, but accumulated tired, the kind that lives in the muscles and the eyes and does not fully leave when a person sleeps. "Whatever your reason is," he said carefully, "I am grateful for the help, and I will ask no more about it than you are willing to tell." She looked at him for a moment, and the expression on her face was complicated in a way he could not decode. Then she said, "That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in quite some time," and she left. He stood in the yard after she went and listened to the morning birds and tried to understand why that sentence had landed in his chest like something he had been waiting to hear. She arrived at 5:55 the next morning, which was to say she arrived before he did, which was something that had never happened with any hand he had ever hired. He found her at the gate of the south field talking to Ruiz in the unhurried way of people who have already determined each other's competence and are simply exchanging useful information. She was wearing a pair of men's work trousers that had been taken in at the waist and a heavy cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she had braided her dark hair and pinned it under a wide-brimmed hat that had clearly seen genuine outdoor use. Ruiz caught Noah's eye over her head and gave a small, respectful nod that meant, "She knows what she is doing." In Ruiz's vocabulary of small nods, that was high praise. The three of them went to work. Sorghum harvest is brutal labor, not delicate, not forgiving of hands that have not done it before. The stalks must be cut and gathered and bundled, and the work demands that you bend and swing and carry in a repetitive motion that will find every weakness in your body and present it to you as a reminder of your limitations. The heat in September in New Mexico is not the killing heat of August, but it is still serious, still the kind that wrings water out of you and replaces it with a heavy, slow tiredness. Birdie Brooks did not slow down. Not at 9 in the morning, not at noon, not at 3 in the afternoon when even Ruiz, who was 22 and built with the lean endurance of someone who had done hard physical labor since childhood, was moving with a deliberate economy that meant he was managing his reserves. She slowed, everyone slows, but she did not stop and she did not complain, and she did not make the small performances of difficulty that people who are unaccustomed to real labor sometimes make unconsciously, the exaggerated sighs, the frequent pauses to straighten and look at how far they have come, the theatrical wiping of the brow. She simply worked. Noah found himself watching her when he should have been watching his own row. He caught himself doing it twice and made himself stop, and then did it again, because there was something about the quality of her work that was not just competent but almost angry, as though she were settling a score with the sorghum, with the heat, with something that had nothing to do with his field and everything to do with whatever she was carrying. At midday he had Cobb's wife Maria bring food out from the main house, cold biscuits and cured beef, and a ceramic jug of water, and the three of them sat in the thin shade of the field's edge and ate without much talking. Ruiz ate with the serious attention of a young man who has worked hard and needs fuel and thinks about nothing else at mealtimes. Birdie ate less than Noah would have expected, which told him she was either not hungry or was in the habit of rationing, and the second possibility bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately account for. "You have done harvest work before," he said. It was not quite a question. She looked up. "My father's farm," she said. "We grew winter wheat mostly, and some corn." "Kansas," he said. "Yes." "What part?" She considered the question for half a beat too long the way she did. "East of Dodge City," she said. "Small farm, nothing like this operation." "What happened to it?" He said it quietly, without particular pressure, giving her room to decline. She was quiet for a moment. "Bank took it," she said, and the three words were flat and final and contained within them the kind of grief that has been compressed by time into something dense and controlled. "After my father died, there was a note, and the harvest that year was poor, and my mother and I could not service the debt alone." He said nothing. He let the silence hold the information. "That is why I offered," she said, looking at the rows of cut sorghum rather than at him. "I am aware of how it looks, a single woman arriving unasked with a mysterious motive. I understand the suspicion." She turned and looked at him directly then, and the gaze was steady and without apology. "But the motive is exactly what I said it was. I watched my father lose his harvest and lose his land and lose his spirit in that order, and I will not stand by and watch that happen to someone else if I can prevent it." Noah looked at her for a long time again. There it was, the thing beneath the words, the dark past that had given shape to the offer. Not a trap, not a hidden scheme, not the manipulation he had been half expecting to find under the surface of the generosity. Just a wound that had taught her something, and a woman acting on what the wound had taught her with the stubborn conviction of someone who has decided that suffering should produce purpose rather than paralysis. "I am sorry," he said, "about your father's farm." "Thank you," she said, simple, like the offer. They went back to work. That evening, after Birdie had left and Ruiz had gone to the bunkhouse, and the day's cut sorghum stood in organized bundles along the south field, Noah sat on the porch of the main house with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and thought about Birdie Brooks in a way that he had not thought about any person in a very long time. He thought about the anger in her work. He thought about the three flat words, "Bank took it." He thought about the way she had looked at him when she told him, steady and without apology, as though she were prepared for him to use the information against her and had decided to tell him anyway. He thought about the particular courage of honesty offered without assurance of safety. He thought about the fact that she was 30 miles from town with a teaching position that paid $20 a month, which was enough to live on in Redemption Creek, but not enough to save anything against, and that she was sleeping in a two-room house behind a schoolhouse with whatever contents were in a single trunk, and that she had offered 2 weeks of her September to a man she barely knew without asking for anything he could not easily give. The night came in purple and full of stars, the way New Mexico nights do, extravagant and indifferent, and Noah Alden sat with his cold coffee and recognized, without being quite able to say what the recognition meant yet, that something had shifted in his understanding of the world today. Something small but not trivial. A door that he had believed was sealed shut, not by someone else's lock but by his own choosing, had moved slightly on its hinges. The first week of the harvest settled into a pattern. Birdie arrived before 6, worked with Ruiz and occasionally with Noah when he could pull himself from the cattle management, ate the midday meal in the field, and left at late afternoon to return to town. On the third day, Noah began to saddle the bay gelding he called Patience at the end of the workday, and he made good on his side of the deal. The first lesson was basic. How to mount astride, how to hold the reins, the language of weight and leg and hand that tells a horse what you want without having to shout it. Birdie learned with the same quality of attention she brought to everything else, focused and unsentimental, and absolutely committed to understanding the actual principle rather than just imitating the surface action. She had ridden before, side saddle as he had guessed, enough to have no fear of horses and enough bad habits to make the relearning slightly frustrating. She accepted the correction without ego, which was rarer than it should be, and she asked precise questions, not what do I do but why does this work, which told him something about the quality of her mind. On the fourth day, she got into an argument with Patience about the direction she wanted to go, and Patience won, and she ended up 20 yards to the left of where she intended, and she stopped and looked at the horse with an expression of pure exasperation, and then started laughing. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it undid something in him completely because it was nothing like the careful social laugh she used in town. It was genuine, startled out of her, full of real amusement at herself, and it transformed her face into something that was not just interesting but beautiful. He was very careful after that to look elsewhere when he felt that particular pull. On the fifth day, 2 things happened that changed the dynamic between them in ways neither could fully account for. The first was that Cobb found rustling sign in the north pasture, fresh cuts in the fence line, and boot prints in the soft earth near the creek, and Noah had to spend 3 hours of the afternoon riding the fence line with Cobb to assess the damage and determine what, if anything, had been taken. The assessment was that nothing had been taken yet, that the fence had been cut as a preliminary scouting operation, and that whoever was doing it was either very patient or very careful or both. In the New Mexico Territory in 1882, cattle rustling was not a minor inconvenience. It was a business, organized and sometimes violent, and the men who ran it had a particular disdain for cattlemen who were already weakened by drought, because weakened meant less likely to have the resources to pursue and prosecute. Noah had heard stories from other ranchers about operations that had been systematically gutted over several months, cattle taken in small amounts that individually seemed like animal loss, but collectively represented a financial wound that finished what the drought had started. He came back from the fence line with a cold, focused anger in his chest that he was careful to keep below the surface. The second thing that happened on that fifth day was that Birdie stayed later than usual. She was finishing a bundle at the far end of the south field, and he walked over to help her tie it, and they ended up side by side in the fading afternoon light with the warm smell of cut sorghum around them, and she said quietly, without preamble, "You found something bad today." He looked at her sharply. "Why do you say that?" "Because you came back from the north pasture with a different quality of quiet," she said. "You were quiet this morning too, but it was ordinary quiet. This afternoon it has weight to it." He was unnerved by the accuracy of that observation. He was also, beneath the unease, something that was closer to relief, the particular relief of being seen by someone when you have grown accustomed to invisibility. "Rustling sign," he said. He had not intended to tell her. The words came out anyway. She was quiet for a moment. "Have you had trouble before?" "Not on this property. The Garin operation north of here lost 30 head last spring. And they never found who did it." The territory marshal came out. "No arrests." He tied the bundle with perhaps more force than was necessary. "The men who do this kind of work know how to be invisible." "You need more people watching the land," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need a great many things I cannot currently afford." She looked at him then, and the look was direct and without the professional distance she usually maintained between them, and she said, "You will get through this, Noah." She used his given name without seeming to notice she had done it, and he noticed, and the noticing made him very still. "You cannot know that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I believe it, which is different from knowing and sometimes more useful." He thought about that on the ride back to the barn, and again that night on the porch, and the thing he kept returning to was not the sentiment but the certainty with which she had delivered it. She believed it. Not as a performance of encouragement, not as the social comfort that people offer each other when they can think of nothing practical to do, but as an actual conviction rooted in something real. What was it rooted in? What did she see when she looked at his operation, at him, that produced that particular certainty? He wanted to ask. He did not ask, but the wanting to ask was itself a change in him, a small seismic shift in the landscape of what he thought he wanted from another person. The second week of the harvest began with a complication that had the shape of a trap. Fletcher Moss arrived on Monday morning. Fletcher Moss was the owner of the Moss Land and Cattle Company, which was the largest operation in the Cimarron River Valley, and which had grown large partly by absorbing smaller operations when those operations encountered the kind of financial pressure that the drought of 1882 was producing with systematic efficiency. He was 45, heavyset, with the particular confidence of a man who has been right about enough business decisions that he has stopped seriously entertaining the possibility of being wrong. He came to the ranch in a good buggy with a matched pair of bays, and he accepted Noah's offer of coffee with the easy manner of a man who is comfortable wherever he sits, and he delivered his proposition with a pleasantness that did not fully conceal the structure of the thing beneath. He wanted to buy the south quarter, the sorghum field. The price he offered was fair, technically, by the standards of land that had been in drought, which meant it was significantly below what the land was worth in any year when the water cooperated. He said he understood Noah's situation, said it with genuine seeming sympathy, said that this offer was the kind that one neighbor made to another when circumstances were difficult, that it was not about opportunism, but about being practical about realities. Noah listened to all of it with the careful attention of a man who is deciding how much to reveal about how much he knows, which was a technique he had learned from his father, and which served him now as it had served him before. When Moss finished, Noah said he would think about it. Moss smiled and said of course, take the time he needed, but the sorghum would have to come in soon, and the window on this particular offer was, naturally, not infinite. He climbed back into his buggy and drove away, and Noah stood in the yard watching the dust settle behind the matched bays. Birdie appeared from the direction of the south field. She had clearly seen the buggy from the field and had stayed at a distance, the discretion of someone who understands that some conversations are private, but now she came forward with a specific purposefulness in her step. "Fletcher Moss," he said before she could ask. Something changed in her face, not surprise exactly. Something more like the confirmation of a suspicion. "He wants something, the south quarter. How much did he offer?" he told her. She was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic, and then she said, "That is not fair value." "No," he agreed, "but it would clear the bank note, and leave you with the rest of the debt and no asset to show for it, and a neighbor who now controls the water access on that side." She said it flatly, not as an opinion but as a fact. He looked at her. You understood all of that immediately. I grew up watching a man make desperate land decisions, she said. I learned what those decisions cost. She met his eyes. You cannot sell that quarter, Noah. He noted again that she used his name. She had begun to do it without seeming to notice, and he had begun to find, without meaning to, that the sound of it in her voice was something he anticipated. I may not have another option, he said. You are halfway through the harvest, she said. Finish the harvest. Sell the crop. That buys you time to think past desperation. And if the crop price does not cover the note, then you will have the same choice to make, but from a position of less desperation. And less desperate decisions are better decisions. She said it with a directness that was not aggressive, but was absolutely without uncertainty. Do not let Fletcher Moss rush you into a mistake. He stood there in the yard and looked at her. This woman who had appeared out of nowhere with her trunk and her references and her careful non-answers to personal questions, and who was now, in her second week of unasked-for service on his behalf, advising him on land strategy with a precision that suggested she had thought about business and loss and recovery with a depth that most people in Redemption Creek had not bothered to develop. "What are you, Birdie Brooks?" he said. He meant it genuinely, not unkindly, more as the admission of a man who has realized that his original model of a person was inadequate. She looked at him for a moment, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded he had yet seen on her, and what it contained was something that could only be described as the desire to answer that question honestly and the fear of what honest answering might cost. "A person who has learned things the hard way," she said, "same as everyone else worth knowing." That evening he did not go to the porch. He went to the barn, which was where he went when he needed to think without the house pressing its walls around him, and he sat in the hay-smelling dark with one of the barn cats in his lap and thought about Birdie Brooks more thoroughly than he had yet allowed himself. He thought about the hidden thing she carried. He thought about Kansas, east of Dodge City, small farm, bank took it. He thought about the trunk and the church reference from Wichita and the way she lived on $20 a month in a two-room house and gave 2 weeks of her September to a man she barely knew because she could not stand to watch loss happen when she had the means to prevent it. He thought about the way her laugh had sounded when Patience deposited her 20 yards to the left. He thought about the rustling sign in the north pasture and the bank note on the kitchen table and Fletcher Moss's timed, patient offer, and the way those three things together had the faint outline of something coordinated, and how he did not yet have enough evidence to call that outline what it might be. And then he thought about something Ruiz had said that afternoon, casually, while they were tying bundles in the south field. Ruiz had said that he had seen a man watching the ranch from the ridge above the north pasture 2 evenings running, and that he had not mentioned it because he was not sure it was anything, but that it was the 3rd time he had seen the same horse silhouetted up there, and something about it made his neck tight. Noah had filed that away and not mentioned it to anyone. Now, in the barn in the dark, he took it out and looked at it beside Fletcher Moss's offer and the rustling sign and the bank note, and the picture they made together had the unmistakable quality of a trap, patient and well laid, and waiting for him to do the desperate thing that desperate men do. He would not do the desperate thing. He would finish the harvest, as Birdie had said, and he would watch the north pasture, and he would not sell Fletcher Moss a single inch of Alden land. He went to bed resolute. On Wednesday of the 2nd week, the trap that he had suspected showed its teeth. He was in the south field with Birdie and Ruiz in the mid-morning when Cobb came running from the direction of the north pasture with the particular gait of a man delivering bad news. 6 head of cattle, Cobb said, gone from the creek section. Fresh tracks leading northwest toward the broken country where following was difficult and the law was thin. Noah stood very still and felt the anger and the helplessness and the very specific fury of a man who has been hit from a direction he was watching while something else was happening from another direction. "How?" he said. "The fence on the west side of the creek section," Cobb said. "Cut last night. Clean work, quiet. I did not hear anything and I was in the north bunkhouse. The man on the ridge, Ruiz said quietly, looking at Noah. Yes, Noah said. The man on the ridge was watching the bunkhouse, making sure everyone was where they were supposed to be. He thought for a moment, the cold precision of a plan forming against the hot rage that wanted to do something immediate and probably foolish. How many horses? 3 riders from the track count, Cobb said, moving the cattle northwest toward the Sangre de Cristo Pass. They will not go far tonight, Noah said. They will camp somewhere in the broken country and move again by morning to put distance between them and here before anyone follows. He looked at Cobb. Saddle 3 horses. You and Ruiz and I go at first light. We follow the trail, but we do not enter the broken country without knowing it. You want to go to the marshal first? Cobb asked. The marshal is 2 hours each way and more comfortable with paperwork than tracking, Noah said. He looked at Ruiz, who was from the territory and knew the land in the particular way of someone who had grown up reading it. Can you track them? Yes, Ruiz said. Noah nodded. He turned to go back to the main house to get his rifle and his thoughts in order, and Birdie was standing beside the sorghum row with her hat in her hands and a look on her face that he had not seen before, which was fear, but fear of a particular kind, the kind that is not for oneself. Be careful, she said. It was 2 words. They hit him with the weight of a great deal more than 2 words. I intend to be, he said. Noah, she stopped him. He turned back. She was looking at him with those dark, direct eyes, and what was in them was something she had not yet put into words, something that had been building through 2 weeks of side-by-side work and midday meals and writing lessons and conversations in the half-dark of late afternoon. These men, if they are organized, if they know your situation, they may be counting on you to do exactly this. Follow them into difficult country where you are outnumbered. He looked at her. She was right. He knew she was right. He also knew he could not simply let 6 head of cattle walk away into the Sangre de Cristo foothills and do nothing, because if he did nothing once they would do it again, and each time the amount taken would grow because unpunished boldness always grows. I will not do anything reckless, he said. That is not a promise, she said. That is a statement of intention which is different. Despite everything, he felt something that was very close to a smile. You are a precise person, Miss Brooks. Yes, she said. I am, and you are important to me, so please be careful. She said it steadily, without breaking eye contact, and then she turned and put her hat back on and went back to work, and Noah stood there for 3 seconds feeling the reverberations of those 5 words. You are important to me, before he made himself move. He did not sleep that night. He reviewed the land in his head, the northwest route from the creek section, the natural camp points in the broken country, the places where the terrain would force a small herd to funnel into predictable channels. He thought about 3 riders moving 6 cattle and what that said about the organization behind them. He thought about Fletcher Moss's buggy and his timed offer, and the man on the ridge. He thought about 5 words and made himself stop thinking about them because he needed his mind on the morning. They rode out at first light, Noah and Cobb and Ruiz, with rifles and enough provisions for a day's tracking. Ruiz picked up the trail quickly, the hoofprints in the caliche soil clear enough in the early morning light, moving northwest as Noah had predicted. They followed it for 4 hours through the broken country without pressing, reading the terrain the way Ruiz had learned to read it, understanding where the trail would go before it went there. What they found, in a box canyon 8 miles northwest of the ranch, was not the rustlers. What they found was the cattle, still in the canyon, and no riders. The riders had cut the cattle loose sometime in the night and were gone, taking nothing with them, leaving the cattle standing in the canyon like a strange gift. Noah sat on his horse at the mouth of the canyon and looked at his 6 head of cattle standing there unharmed and tried to understand what it meant. It meant that someone had called off the operation in the night. It meant that whoever had ordered this had changed their mind, or had received information that changed the calculation, or was sending a different message than the one Noah had initially read. Cobb said, "What do we think happened?" Someone decided the risk was not worth it, Ruiz said slowly. Or someone told them to stop. Noah thought about Fletcher Moss. He thought about a man who was smart enough to want the South Quarter badly enough to orchestrate pressure, but who was also smart enough to know that dead or missing cattle could bring the territory marshal and federal attention that would be inconvenient for a man of Moss's size and visibility. If the plan had been to break Noah financially through a combination of debt pressure and stock loss, the plan required Noah to not pursue the matter legally with sufficient energy to actually threaten Moss's position. Perhaps Moss had decided the approach was too direct. Perhaps he had decided to be patient and wait for the debt alone to do the work. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that sat most uncomfortably in Noah's mind, someone had intervened in some way he did not yet understand. They drove the 6-head home without incident. Noah spent the afternoon in the field, finishing the day's harvest work, saying little, thinking much. At the end of the day's work, he paid Ruiz his wages for the week, and he turned to Birdie, who was tying the last bundle of the day, and he said, "We found the cattle. Someone cut them loose in the night." She turned and looked at him. The relief on her face was immediate and genuine, and beneath it, very briefly, was something else, something he could not quite read, almost like guilt. "I am glad they are safe," she said. "Birdie," he said. He had started using her given name too, without quite deciding to, the formality of Miss Brooks having dissolved somewhere in the second week between the sorghum rows and the riding lessons. "Is there something you know about this situation that I should know?" She was quiet. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of something but the presence of a decision being made. "I sent a letter," she said finally, "the night you told me about the rustling. I sent a letter to a man named Whitmore in Cimarron City. He is a lawyer, and he has been building a case against organized rustling operations in this territory for 2 years. I told him about the fence cuts and the man on the ridge and about Fletcher Moss's timed offer." Noah stared at her. "You know Whitmore?" "I know of him," she said carefully. "My father's case, when the bank foreclosed, there were questions about whether the foreclosure was proper. Whitmore was the name that came up as someone who investigated those kinds of irregularities. I wrote to him then. He could not help, the statute of limitations had passed, but I kept his name." "You wrote to a territory lawyer without telling me," he said. "Yes." She met his eyes. "I knew you would not have wanted me to. I knew you would have said it was your matter to handle, and I could not watch the trap closing and do nothing." He should have been angry. He stood there and examined the question of whether he was angry, and found that what he actually felt was something more complicated than anger, something that included gratitude and unease, and a startled recognition of how completely this woman had inserted herself into his crisis without ever being asked, without ever being given permission. Acting from what she had said was the same impulse that brought her to his yard in the first place. The inability to stand by when she had the means to help. "You could have told me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I should have. I am sorry I did not." "Why did you not?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid that if I told you, you would have told me it was not my place, and I was not certain I would have listened, which would have put us in a difficult position." Despite himself, he felt the pull of that startled, genuine laugh she had aimed at Patience. He did not laugh, but something in him lightened. "That is a remarkably honest answer," he said. "I try to be honest when I have been less than fully transparent," she said. "It seems like the minimum." "Whitmore," he said. "Do you think he can help?" "I think his letter to Moss, if he sent one, may have been what caused the cattle to be returned," she said. A lawyer's interest in an organized rustling operation involving a specific named party is the kind of thing that changes a man's calculations. Noah thought about this. He thought about the timing the letter sent, the cattle returned the following night, the rustlers withdrawing without taking anything. It fit. It was not proof, but it fit. "I will write to Whitmore myself," he said, "and I will tell him everything I know." "That would be wise," she said. They looked at each other across the cut sorghum, in the late afternoon light that was turning the field golden, and the air between them had changed again, in the way it had been changing incrementally throughout the 2 weeks. each conversation adding something to the weight of it, each shared silence thickening the invisible thing that was building in the space they occupied together. "Why did you really come here, Birdie?" he said. He meant to this ranch, but he also meant to Redemption Creek, and she understood both meanings. She took a long breath. "I was running," she said. "I told you the truth about my father's farm. After we lost it, my mother and I went to Wichita. My mother died the following year, consumption. I taught school in Wichita for 3 years, and I was engaged to a man named Gerald Cross who turned out to be someone very different from who he presented himself to be." She said it evenly, but the evenness cost her something. He could hear the cost of it. "When I ended the engagement, the social situation became difficult." He told stories. The kind of stories that are impossible to disprove, and that follow a woman the way a shadow follows a body. She paused, "So I left. I took the furthest position I could find from a church that still had references I could rely on, and I came here, and I intended to stay quiet and teach my students and build a small life that belonged entirely to me." She stopped. He waited. "And then I saw someone in trouble," she said. "And I am constitutionally incapable of seeing that and doing nothing about it." She looked at him. "That is the complete truth, all of it." He looked at her for a long time. The long kind of looking that had become, over the course of 2 weeks, its own private language between them. "Gerald Cross," he said. "He lied about you." "Yes." "What did he say?" "That I had been involved with another man during our engagement. That my character was not what it appeared. That the broken engagement was my fault for reasons that he was too gentlemanly to specify, but which were implied to be moral failings." She said it with a steadiness that was clearly the product of having made peace with it, not of it not hurting. In a town the size of Wichita, that kind of story is sufficient to make a teaching position untenable and a social life impossible. Noah was quiet for a moment. The anger he felt on her behalf was quiet and very deep, the kind that does not express itself loudly because it is looking for the right lever. "He was lying," he said. "Not a question." "Completely," she said. "Do you know why? Because I had refused to continue an engagement with a man whose true character, once I understood it, was not one I could respect. And some men," she said with a precision that was almost clinical, "cannot tolerate the refusal of a woman, and they will use whatever tools they have to make her pay for it." "Yes," he said. "I know men like that." She looked at him. "Do you believe me?" "Yes," he said. No hesitation, no qualification. He said it the way she had said that he would get through this, not as a performance but as a conviction. Something in her face shifted, something she had been holding tightly, and she looked away quickly, toward the field, and he understood that the look away was not dismissal but the management of an emotion that had surprised her in its strength. "Thank you," she said. The same 2 words she had said before, when he told her he would ask no more than she was willing to tell. Simple, carrying a great deal. The last 2 days of the harvest were the best days of Noah Alden's recent memory, which was a thing that surprised him because they were hard physical days in September heat, and his body was tired, and his concerns had not resolved themselves. But something had resolved in the air between him and Birdie. The hidden motive had been named and was no longer hidden. The secrets had been offered and received, and what was left was 2 people who knew each other, or were beginning to, in the real sense of knowing that requires the removal of protective layers. They talked while they worked, not always about important things. Sometimes about the students she taught, the particular characters of the children of Redemption Creek with their specific difficulties and gifts. Sometimes about the cattle, the herd management decisions he had been considering, and she asked questions that showed she was genuinely interested in the logic of it. Sometimes about nothing in particular, just the comfortable talk of people who are occupying the same space and have decided they like doing so. On the second-to-last day, in the afternoon riding lesson, she finally got patience to do what she asked consistently, the horse responding to her leg and weight signals with a willingness that meant she had properly communicated her request rather than just made a noise in the horse's general direction. She stopped in the middle of the corral, and the look on her face was pure, uncomplicated triumph. And Noah was leaning on the corral fence watching, and he felt, very clearly and without ambiguity, that he was in serious trouble. He had not intended to fall in love with Birdie Brooks. He had not, if he was being honest, intended to fall in love with anyone. After his father's death, he had pulled the ranch together alone because there was no one else to do it, and the solitude had become habitual, and the habit had eventually been reclassified as preference, and the preference had settled into the architecture of his life like a load-bearing wall that he had stopped noticing. But the trouble with load-bearing walls is that when something shifts them, even slightly, the entire structure of the building tells you about it. He was in trouble, he was clear-eyed about it, and he had absolutely no idea what to do about it because Birdie Brooks had come here running from one man's damage and had built something small and careful for herself, and the last thing she needed was another man deciding what she should feel and when. So he said nothing. He watched her triumph over patience with the warmth in his chest that he could not prevent and would not have wanted to, and he said, "You have that now. It will stay with you." She looked at him over the corral fence, flushed from the heat and the effort and the victory, and said, "You are a good teacher. You are a good student," he said. "The two are not separable." She held his gaze for a moment, and there was something in her eyes that he could not entirely read, but that made the warmth in his chest sharpen into something more specific. And then she dismounted with the new competence she had and led Patience back to the rail, and that was the end of that. The last day of the harvest fell on a Friday, the 15th of September. The south field came in entirely clean, the sorghum bundled and stacked and ready for the grain press. And when the last bundle was tied in late afternoon, and the three of them stood back and looked at the finished work, there was the specific satisfaction of completed labor that no other feeling quite duplicates. Ruiz said something under his breath in Spanish that Noah recognized as an expression of devout gratitude, and Noah felt the same, though his version was quieter and less structured. He turned to Birdie. She was looking at the field with an expression that was not just satisfaction, but something older and more complex, the look of someone who has done a thing specifically because another person was not able to do it, and who is receiving from the completion of that thing a particular redemption. "Your father's harvest," he said quietly. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright with something she was managing carefully. "Maybe," she said, "something like that." "I owe you a debt," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "We made a fair deal. I have learned to ride a horse properly. We are even. Birdie." He said her name the way he said her name now, which was not with the careful professional remove he had used at the beginning, but with the weight of everything the 2 weeks had put into it. "I owe you more than the riding lessons, and we both know it." She looked at him and did not contradict him. He had been thinking, through the last 2 days, about what he wanted to say and how to say it with the precision that a thing this important deserved. He had considered several versions of it and discarded them. He had decided, finally, that the version that sounded most like him was the simplest one. "I would like to call on you," he said, "if you are willing, properly, with Reverend Hadley's wife Constance informed and everything conducted as it ought to be. I am asking permission to court you, Birdie Brooks, and I will understand completely if you need time to consider it or if the answer is no." She was looking at him with an expression that was working very hard to remain measured and was not entirely succeeding. "You are asking me to be courted," she said. "Yes, Noah Alden, after everything I have told you. About Gerald Cross and the story he told and why I came here and what I was trying to build. Because of all those things," he said, "not in spite of them, because every single one of those things tells me exactly who you are and why I am asking." She was quiet for a long moment. The evening light was settling over the finished field, golden and long, and the air smelled of cut sorghum and the distant sage of the high desert, and somewhere in the north pasture, one of the cattle was making the low sound that cattle make when they are content and settled and safe. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes." He felt the yes land in his chest like something that had been precisely the right shape for a space that had been empty for a long time. He did not take her hand. Not yet. There was a right way to do this, and he intended to do it the right way, partly because the right way was what she deserved and partly because he understood, from everything she had told him about Gerald Cross, that the right way was not a formality to her but a reassurance, a proof that the word yes would be honored exactly as it was given. "I will come to the schoolhouse on Sunday afternoon," he said. With Constance Hadley's full knowledge and probably a great deal of her enthusiasm. Birdie laughed. The real one, the startled, genuine one that transformed her face. "She will be insufferable about it," she said. "Yes," he said, "she really will be." They stood together in the finished field in the late afternoon light, and it was not dramatic, not cinematic in the way of a story that wants to announce its own turning points. It was quiet and it was real, and it was the most right thing that either of them had felt in a long time. The courtship of Birdie Brooks and Noah Alden was conducted, as promised, with the full and energetic endorsement of Constance Hadley, who treated the enterprise as a personal achievement of her own, and who was so thoroughly pleased with herself about it that the entire town of Redemption Creek knew within a week. This was, in the event, not a bad thing. The publicity of it, the social sanction of it, the visible approval of Reverend Hadley and his wife, served a specific and practical purpose. It preemptively answered the questions that Redemption Creek would have asked anyway about Birdie Brooks and her 2 weeks at the Alden Ranch. Caleb Marsh tried once, at the general store counter, to suggest with a raised eyebrow and a particular tone that 2 weeks alone with a rancher required explaining. And Constance Hadley, who happened to be present, turned on him with the devastating efficiency of a woman who has spent 20 years as the administrative center of a small town's social life and knows exactly where every pressure point is. And Caleb Marsh did not raise that eyebrow again. Noah came to the schoolhouse on Sunday afternoons. They walked together along Cotter Road and talked about everything they had not yet talked about, which was a great deal, because they were both people who had a great deal stored up from the years of their private solitudes. They talked about his father, who had been a hard man but a fair one, who had built the ranch from nothing, and who had left Noah not just the land but the particular way of seeing the land, as a responsibility rather than a possession. They talked about her mother, who had been soft-spoken but made of iron, who had managed the grief of her husband's death and the loss of the farm with a quiet competence that Birdie had tried to inherit as completely as she could. They talked about books, because they were both readers, and they discovered with the particular pleasure of that discovery that they had read many of the same things and disagreed about some of them in ways that were interesting rather than divisive. They talked about the territory, its future, the question of statehood, and what it would mean for the ranching operations and the school districts and the law, which in 1882 was still thin in ways that created the conditions for men like whoever had employed those 3 rustlers in the night. Whitmore, the Cimarron city lawyer, had written back. His letter to Noah confirmed that he had been investigating a pattern of organized pressure applied to smaller operations in the valley, and that Fletcher Moss's name appeared in the pattern in ways that were not yet legally actionable, but that Whitmore was building toward. He had advised Noah to document everything, to preserve any evidence, and to continue operating as normally as possible. He had also said, with a lawyer's careful language, that the return of the cattle suggested that someone in the operation had received sufficient warning to believe that continued activity was more dangerous than profitable, which was the best outcome short of prosecution. Noah had shown the letter to Birdie. He showed it to her because she had initiated the contact and because she deserved to know the result, but also because he had begun, without fully articulating the decision, to treat her judgment as something he wanted access to in matters that concerned the ranch. She read it carefully and said that Whitmore seemed thorough, and that thorough was more useful than fast, and that she would feel safer when Moss's operation was fully documented. So would I, Noah said. But safer than before, which is something. Yes, she said, something is a great deal more than nothing. The sorghum crop sold in October at a price that, combined with what the cattle drive had brought in September, came within serviceable distance of the bank note. Not all of it, not the full satisfaction of the debt, but enough to renegotiate the terms with the bank in Cimarron City, enough to buy time that was no longer measured in weeks but in seasons. The land manager at the bank was a man named Henderson who was practical and who preferred a performing loan to a foreclosure, and the renegotiation was conducted without drama and with a handshake that meant something. Noah drove back from Cimarron City in the wagon with the renegotiated papers in his coat pocket and stopped at the schoolhouse at the end of the school day and knocked on the door. Birdie opened it with her hands still chalky and her hair slightly disordered from a full day of teaching, and he held up the papers without saying anything, and the look on her face was the one he had been thinking about all the way back from Cimarron City, the one that made the warmth in his chest do the thing it had been doing since the afternoon she laughed at Patience. "Come in," she said. "I will make coffee." They sat at the small table in the schoolhouse, not the parlor of someone's house with a chaperone, just the two of them at the teacher's table among the small desks and the slate boards, and he told her everything Henderson had said and the terms of the new arrangement and what it meant for the South Quarter and the cattle operation going forward. When he was done, she said, "You are going to be all right." "Yes," he said. "I believe I am." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the schoolhouse was quiet around them with the particular quiet of a room full of children-shaped absences, and the late October light was coming through the single window at the low angle that October light always comes, golden and a little melancholy, and Noah Alden made a decision. He set down his coffee cup and he said, "Birdie, I need to say something and I want to say it correctly, so I am going to take a moment to find the right words." She put down her own cup and looked at him steadily without filling the pause, which was one of the things he most valued about her. "I have been alone for a long time," he said. "Not unhappily alone, mostly. I had the ranch and the work, and that was sufficient, and I had told myself it was sufficient for long enough that I had stopped examining whether it was actually true." He paused. "You appeared in my yard in September and offered something that could have been charity and was actually something else entirely, and I have been trying since that morning to understand what you are to me, what this is, and I have arrived at an understanding that I want to share with you." She was very still. "You are the most real person I have encountered in a very long time," he said. "You are honest when honesty costs you something, which is the only kind of honesty that means anything. You are brave in the quiet, persistent way that is harder than the dramatic kind. You are smarter than you let people know, which is a habit I recognize because I do the same thing. You have a laugh that I think about when I am not near you." He stopped. "I am in love with you, Birdie Brooks. I have been trying not to say so because I did not want to complicate what you are building here for yourself, and I have concluded that not saying so is itself a dishonesty, and I will not do it any longer." The October light fell across the small table between them, and Birdie looked at him, and her eyes were the particular bright they became when she was managing an emotion that surprised her, and she said, "I love you too, Noah." She said it quietly but without hesitation, in the way she said the things she truly meant, as facts rather than performances. "I have been trying not to say so for approximately the same reasons. I came here to build something that belonged to me, and the idea of it belonging to someone else, of me belonging to someone else again, frightened me. It should not be either or," he said. "What you are building belongs to you. That does not preclude belonging to each other." She looked at him for a long time, and then she said, "No, it does not." He reached across the small table and took her hand, the chalk-dusty hand of a woman who had been teaching children all day, and held it in both of his, and the schoolhouse was very quiet and the light was going golden through the window, and it was, without any flourish or fanfare, one of the finest moments of his life. He asked her to marry him at Christmas. He asked her properly, with Reverend Hadley present and a ring that had been his mother's, a small band of gold with a garnet set into it that the Alden women had worn for 2 generations. He had taken it out of the box in his father's desk where it had lived since his mother's death, and he had carried it in his coat pocket for 3 weeks before he asked, which was not hesitation about the asking, but about finding the right moment, the right quality of rightness that a question like that deserved. He found it on Christmas Eve, at the small celebration that Constance Hadley hosted every year for the Redemption Creek community, when the room was warm with lamp light, and the smell of pine boughs and the cheerful noise of 30 people who know each other well gathered together in a season that asks for warmth. He found Birdie on the edge of the gathering, watching the children play with the intensity of a woman whose professional attention to children never fully went off duty, and he took her by the hand and led her to the quieter end of the hall where the lamp light was less crowded, and he went down on one knee. She put her hand over her mouth, just for a moment, and then she dropped it because she was Birdie Brooks and she did not hide behind her hands, and she said yes before he had finished asking. The entire room, which had been watching with the unified attention of a community that has been hoping for exactly this, erupted with a celebration that was entirely out of proportion to the scale of the moment, and Constance Hadley cried and was not embarrassed about it, and Ruiz shook Noah's hand with genuine warmth, and Cobb's wife Maria hugged Birdie for a long time. They were married in February of 1883, in the Redemption Creek Church on a cold, clear day with a sky so intensely blue it looked painted, and the 31 students of the Redemption Creek School sat in the front pews in their best clothes and watched their teacher marry the Cattleman with the serious and romantic attention of children who understand that they are witnessing something important. The ceremony was simple and direct, which suited them both, and when Reverend Hadley pronounced them married, Noah looked at Birdie in the February light coming through the church windows and thought that this was what it was supposed to look like, this specific thing, this particular quality of rightness that you either recognize when you see it or you do not, and he recognized it completely. They went back to the Alden Ranch, which was Birdie's home now, and she stood in the kitchen of the main house on the first evening and looked around at it with an expression that was taking possession of something in the quiet, committed way she did everything, and he leaned in the doorway and watched her and felt the happiness of a man who has come home from a place he had not known was too far away. She taught through the spring term. They had agreed she would continue if she wished, and she wished, because the children were hers in the way that things become yours when you give them serious care, and she was not prepared to simply hand them to someone new when she had built something with them. The school board, to its credit, had no objection, and the town of Redemption Creek, which had spent 6 months cataloging Birdie Brooks with suspicion, had arrived at a consensus that she was, in fact, exactly what she had appeared to be, and had decided to be proud of having recognized it. The matter of Fletcher Moss resolved itself in the spring as well. Whitmore's investigation, patient and thorough as promised, produced enough documented evidence of organized rustling coordination, evidence that included testimonies from 3 men who had been arrested in a separate incident in the Sangre de Cristo country, and who were willing to talk in exchange for consideration, that the territory marshal took a serious interest. Moss was never charged in the end with anything that carried sufficient weight for a court conviction, because the men who worked for him had been careful about the chain of command. But his operation came under a scrutiny that lasted several months, and that cost him, in the way that sustained scrutiny always costs men who prefer to work in shadow, considerably more than a legal judgment would have cost him. And the south quarter of the Alden land, the sorghum field, remained exactly where it had always been, Alden property, which was the outcome that mattered. By summer, Birdie had planted a kitchen garden in the south corner of the house yard, with the same focused energy she brought to everything, and the ranch hands had developed an affectionate and slightly awed regard for her, because she treated them as colleagues rather than as subordinates, and she never said anything she did not mean, and she had been known to help mend fence in the morning before school if the section was close enough and she had time. Maria Cobb said to Cobb one evening that Mrs. Alden was the kind of woman who improved any enterprise she was part of, and Cobb said yes, that seemed about right, and they left it at that because some truths do not require expansion. Birdie stopped teaching at the end of the summer term, not because she was asked to, but because she was carrying their first child, and because the school board, in its 1883 understanding of these things, would have asked her to stop eventually anyway, and she preferred to make the decision herself before it could be made for her. She recommended to the board a woman from Las Vegas, New Mexico, named Clara Romero, who was young and fiercely capable, and the board hired Clara on Birdie's recommendation, and the students of Redemption Creek transitioned into Clara's care, as well as children can transition when the person leaving has prepared them thoughtfully for the change. Birdie did not stop teaching. She simply changed the location of the classroom. She taught Noah's hands to read in the evenings, those who wanted to learn, and 2 of them did, and she ran the ranch books with a precision that had Noah's margins improving in ways he had not managed alone, because she had a particular clarity about numbers that came from having seen, close up, what happens when the numbers are not watched carefully. She organized the household the way she organized everything else, with systems that had logic behind them and flexibility built in, and the main house went from a place where a man lived alone to a place that felt inhabited, genuinely inhabited in the fullest sense. In November of 1883, their son was born. He came into the world on a clear, cold November night with the stars outside the window doing their extravagant New Mexico thing, attended by the doctor from Redemption Creek and Maria Cobb, and a quality of focused, present calm from Birdie that was, the doctor privately told his wife later, the most remarkable thing he had seen in 30 years of obstetric practice. They named him James Henry Alden, James for Birdie's father and Henry for Noah's. He was a solid, serious-faced baby who surveyed the world from the first with an expression that suggested he was reserving judgment, and Noah held him on the first morning and felt the specific enormous weight of the future in his arms. "He looks like you," Birdie said from the bed, watching them. "No," Noah said. "He looks like himself, which is the right way for a person to look." She smiled. The real smile, the one that did not manage itself. James Henry Alden grew into a toddler with strong opinions about horses, specifically that he wanted to be near them at all times, and that this was not a preference but a fact about the natural order of the world. Birdie taught him to say their names before he could say much else. Patience was his favorite, which Birdie found deeply satisfying for reasons that she explained to Noah one evening with the particular amusement of someone revisiting a significant memory. "That horse deposited me 20 yards to the left," she said. "And you laughed," Noah said. "And you watched me laugh," she said, with an expression that I noticed even then. "What expression?" "The one you get when something matters to you," she said. "You think it is not visible, it is visible." He looked at her. "How long have you known that?" "Since approximately the 2nd day," she said, "when you were watching me work in the field and you thought I did not notice." He was quiet for a moment. "You noticed." "I notice everything about you," she said simply, the way she said the things she truly meant. He reached over, where they were sitting on the porch in the October evening with James asleep inside, and took her hand, and they sat together in the high desert dusk with the cattle settled in the north pasture, and the sorghum field standing ready for its second harvest, and the sky going its impossible colors over the Cimarron Hills. The second child came in the spring of 1886, a daughter this time. They named her Margaret, after Birdie's mother, Maggie from the first day, though the full name went into the family Bible with its proper weight. Maggie arrived into the world with considerable enthusiasm and very specific opinions, and by the time she was 2, she had the ranch hands wrapped entirely around her small finger, and was communicating those opinions with a vocabulary that had everyone, including Noah, raising their eyebrows at the precision of it. "She is like you," Noah said to Birdie, watching 3-year-old Maggie systematically reorganize the arrangement of the front porch chairs into a configuration she found more logical. "She is like herself," Birdie said, returning his words from 3 years ago with a satisfaction that was not smug but was definitely pleased. Ruiz had by that point become the ranch foreman, which was a title Noah gave him in 1885, and which formalized what had been true in practice for 2 years. He was 25, and he ran the cattle operation with a competence that freed Noah to look further ahead, to think about the ranch's future in the way that a man can only think about the future when he trusts the present is being properly managed. James took his first solo ride on Patience in the spring of 1887, at 3.5, which was young but not impossibly so, and Patience seemed to understand the assignment and moved with an uncharacteristic gentleness. Birdie stood at the corral fence with her hand on the rail, watching, and the expression on her face was something Noah could read completely by then, having spent 5 years learning its vocabulary. It was love and pride, and a shadow of grief for all the people who should have been there to see it and were not, and the quiet determination to be fully present for this moment, and not let the grief take more than its fair share. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him briefly, the way people do when they trust the person beside them completely, the way she had learned over 5 years to trust. "Your father would have loved to see this," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "He would have." They watched James on Patience circle the corral with the solemn concentration of a small boy who has been given a serious responsibility and intends to honor it. And the spring day was warm, and the south field was greening up for the planting season, and the ranch was alive around them in all its specific, daily, unglamorous, entirely beautiful ordinary life. Whitmore wrote in 1887 to say that a more comprehensive investigation into the organized rustling networks of the Cimarron Valley had concluded successfully, with 3 convictions and the dissolution of the coordinated operation that had threatened smaller ranchers, including the Alden operation in the fall of 1882. The letter was dry and lawyerly and matter-of-fact, and Birdie read it at the kitchen table and set it down and said, "Good." "That is all," Noah said. "What else is there to say?" She looked up. Justice was done, eventually, imperfectly in the way that it mostly is. Good is the right response to that. Fletcher Moss had sold his operation in 1886 and moved to Denver. Whether this was related to the investigation or simply a business decision, Whitmore's letter did not say, and Noah found that he did not particularly care. What mattered was that the valley was quieter now, the smaller operations were safer, and the Alden South Quarter was still Alden. The years did what years do, which is to say they accumulated. They accumulated in the way that good years accumulate, not dramatically, not with the intensity of crisis and resolution, but with the steady layering of ordinary days that are each, individually, more than sufficient. A 3rd child arrived in 1889, a boy they named Thomas, who was the loudest of the 3 from his first breath and who would, they would eventually come to understand, grow into a person of enormous generosity and slightly less enormous ability to be quiet about anything. He was adored immediately and completely by James and Maggie, who had been waiting for him with an impatience that demonstrated that they had entirely absorbed their mother's inability to simply wait when something good was on its way. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, not with the ambition of a man trying to outgrow his neighbors, but with the steady, purposeful expansion of people who knew what they were building and why. Another quarter section, purchased fair in 1890 when old Henderson at the bank retired, and his replacement proved to be a man of similar practicality. A new bunkhouse for the expanded crew. A second well drilled in the south quarter over the aquifer that had saved the sorghum field in 1882. Birdie started a school at the ranch for the Hand's children, 3 of whom were now of school age, and word spread and 2 neighboring ranch families asked if their children could attend. And within a year there were 9 students receiving lessons 3 mornings a week in the front room of the main house, and Birdie had quietly and without any announcement become a teacher again, which was what she was, as much as she was anything. Noah watched this development with the specific happiness of a man who has managed to build a life that contains all the versions of the people he loves, rather than requiring them to choose between them. On a September morning in 1892, 10 years almost to the week from the morning Birdie had appeared at his gate, Noah was on the south porch with his first coffee of the day, watching the early light come over the Cimarron Hills when Birdie came and sat beside him. She sat close, in the way she did now without thinking, their shoulders touching, the easy physical language of 2 people who have shared a life for a decade. "I have been thinking," she said, "about something." "What something?" "About 10 years ago," she said. "About standing in someone's yard and offering something that could have seemed peculiar and watching him look at me as though I was a problem he was trying to solve." He smiled. "You were a problem I was trying to solve. And did you solve me?" "No," he said. "I married you instead, which turned out to be the better approach." She laughed. The genuine one, the one that still, 10 years later, hit him in the chest with the particular accuracy of something aimed at an exact target. "I was so frightened," she said, "standing in that yard. I had worked up my nerve all the way from town, and when you opened the gate I nearly lost it entirely. You looked so certain of everything, so completely in possession of yourself. I was terrified," he said. "A woman I did not understand had appeared and offered me something I could not account for, and I could not afford to seem weak, but I was also trying very hard not to seem threatening because I could see you were already braced for a difficult response." She turned and looked at him. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything about you," he said, returning her words from 7 years ago. "I have since the second day." She looked at him for a long moment with the look that he knew completely by now, the one that meant she was feeling something fully and choosing not to contain it, the one that she had gradually, over 10 years, allowed herself to wear openly in his presence because she had learned empirically that it was safe. "I am glad I was brave enough to open the gate," she said. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The morning light was coming over the hills in the way that September light comes in New Mexico, warm and long and particular, the same light that had been in the yard the morning she stood at his gate, and the field had smelled of ripe sorghum, and he had looked at her for a long time trying to understand what he was seeing. He understood it now. He had understood it for years. He was still not sure he could have said, in words that would fully convey it, exactly what she was, because what she was included the mother of his children, and the keeper of his books, and the teacher of ranch children in the front room, and the woman who could not stand by when someone needed help, and the person who had saved his harvest and his land, and without either of them quite seeing it happen, the entire center of his life. But she was sitting beside him in the September morning with her shoulder against his, and in a few minutes the children would be awake and the day would start, and the ranch would be alive around them with its specific noise and need and business. And Thomas would announce something at the top of his considerable lungs, and Maggie would correct him on a point of fact, and James would be at the barn before anyone asked him to be. And all of it, the whole improbable, hard-won, beautiful, ordinary accumulation of it, had begun because a woman with a dark past and a particular stubbornness about standing by had looked at a field that needed to come in and a man who needed help, and had walked up to a gate in September and offered. And a cattleman had looked at her for a long time and then had said yes. He took her hand in the September morning and held it the way he had held it in that chalk-dusted schoolhouse almost a decade ago, and she looked at the hills and the field and the light, and she was home, genuinely home, in the fullest sense of a word that had taken her a long time to trust again. They sat together in the morning and let the day come to them.